Hello and welcome. You're listening to Adventures in the Vale, an RPG discussion podcast. I'm Jake.
I'm Ross.
Sit back and relax by the fire, for there are tales to be told.
Hello, travelers. Welcome to the Cozy Crow. Come and sit by our fire. May I get you something to drink?
Yeah, I'll take an ale.
I'll have that right out.
Hello and welcome again to the Adventures in the Vale Tavern Cast. My name is Ross McClure, and here in the tavern we talk about folk RPGs. I'm joined today with Travis Miller from the Grumpy Wizard video and written blogs. Travis gives really insightful thoughts about old school and classical tabletop role-playing. I found it really useful, just both for myself and in discussions at the Play Club with new referees. And it provides some of the clearest and simplest advice I've seen for what I think are some really deep concepts that are important to new OSR referees. Welcome to the tavern, Travis.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
So, Travis, there's a lot I want to ask you, but there's two major things that I wanted to talk to you about, kind of two blogs that you made. One is about this idea of an open gaming concept. And then the other one is that sandboxing, if you're coming into an old school game or an indie game that has more of a focus on exploration, that if you have some essential elements, that it will work well. And I want to ask you about those two things, but starting with this idea of an open gaming concept, very simply put, what is the open gaming concept?
Well, it's an idea that I first came across reading a book by Rob Kunst called the Dave Arneson's True Genius. And I've since sort of not quite followed Rob on all the way down the path that he has taken with that idea. I've diverged a little bit, but the basic idea of it is that you have in games two type of systems. There's a closed system game, which is like a chess game or a board game or a computer game, where once you start play, the game is closed. There's nothing you can add to it. There's nothing you can take away from it, or you're not playing the game. And all the participants in the game, before the game starts, agree to the same rule set. They say, this is the win state, this is the lose state, these are the things that are included in the game, these are the things that are excluded from the game, and it's a closed system. An open system game is a game where concepts or ideas from outside of the game can enter in during the play of the game. So that's fundamentally what differentiates between a closed system game and an open system game. And what Rob asserts is that the Blackmore game, and I would say also what preceded it, which was the Brownstein war game experiments that Dave Wesley created, was a combination of closed system and open system. And what I think he means by that is that you have certain parts of the game are closed systems and certain parts of the game are open systems. And sometimes the open system intrudes on the closed system and sort of says, well, wait a minute, we have a problem here, or the closed system is insufficient to the task that we're putting it to. So we have to insert something in here to make this work.
Okay. I want to take that and kind of like peel it apart a little bit, but
Sure.
the first thing I'd like to do is create some touchstones for somebody that our audience primarily, who this is for, although I think anybody could listen to these these podcasts and gain something from it. But it's for particularly people that are coming over from the brand game, the big and game, or if they're starting in tabletop role-playing games for the first time and they're starting with indie games, OSR games, and they're starting out here. So let's imagine like we've got some dungeon masters or players and they're used to Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition. Now you use the example of 4th edition, so I think maybe that more clearly is like that, right? Like it has these clear, you're going to activate this ability and you have these powers, and you're going to press those buttons at certain times and stuff, and you're going to interact with those systems. But I think it's probably true of Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition. It's a very tightly wound system. It offers a lot of things. So let's say you're in a common situation in the game, like I don't know, the classic. You're traveling down a corridor and you suspect that there's something there. Like there's something there, either a trap or a monster or an ambush. What would that look like for the modern player that is not doing that? They're not using this kind of open game system. They're relying more on the closed system. What would that look like, just normally in a session of play? Yeah.
So 5th edition, I think, importantly, kind of stepped away from the closed system approach. You can play it in a more open system approach. The problem is you have, the culture of play that started with 3rd edition and became really intense in 4th edition play, and then just people sort of thought, well, this is just how you do it, so they carried it over. What that generally looks like if you're using the closed system approach is you are looking for a rule or a mechanism or a procedure that's written down in the book that's preceded the players to the table, so to speak, where you're saying, I want to roll this check. Typically it's going to be something for the modern game. It's going to be something called perception. In certain other, mechanics first kind of games, they might call it a spot check or a search check. It really depends. But fundamentally, what you're doing is you're using a mechanism of the game to interact with the conceptual construct that we're all sort of building in our brain as we go along in the system. An open type method would be the player sort of imagining themselves in the place of their character and thinking about what they might do to discover a trap. So they might use a tool, the classic 10-foot pole, tapping ahead. They might toss a lit torch down the hallway. They might pour out water from a flask to see if the hallway has a grade to it, where it's going downhill somewhere, or maybe to detect a pit trap where water spills along a certain line within the hallway. They might send an animal or a charmed monster or something like that down the hall first. There's a bunch of different approaches you could take to it that are generally not specifically looking into a rule book and rolling dice. It's simply imagining, what would I do if I was there in the place of my character.
Okay. Let me, I'm going to, just to help me visualize it, I'm going to grab a random modern OSR adventure. Okay. This is Incandescent Grottos by Gavin Norman in the Crocknut. Okay. So I'm going to just flip to, because there are plenty of hallways. So I'm going to flip to a hallway, and I guarantee it'll have stuff in it. There'll be something going on, because that's kind of the approach a lot. All right, so here we are. Dark stone blocks. It's dank and dripping from the ceiling, and there's wet debris about places, and this is foreshadowing the existence of these, what it calls gelatinous squirms, 4-foot-long slug-like slimy creatures. that lurk silently along the ceiling. And it telegraphs that using these, indications that there's slime along the stones and stuff. So here I am, and we're a group of players, playing characters, and we're on the near side of this hallway, and we see this, the referee says, the stone blocks are pockmarked with something that has eaten away at it. It's dank, and the debris along the floor is wet, and there's slime trails along the floor of the ceiling. So something's there. And so you're saying in a modern game, a person might say, I'd like to roll a perception check. Is that, is that right? And then
something along those lines, yeah. And it's not a 100% always this way kind of thing. Because I have received some pushback from some 5e gamers that said, well, we don't do it that way. And totally. 5e does absolutely allow you to do that. There are some games and some gamers and some game masters that want you to roll the dice, use a skill, use an ability from the game system instead of interacting directly with the game master and having the game master describe what you see. And then, let's say you tie a torch onto a pole because the ceiling's too high, and you hold it up there, and oh wait, here's these slimy little critters, and we got to do something about that.
Gotcha. Yeah. Okay.
So rather than it's in a lot of ways, it's kind of applying common sense and general knowledge to these things. I sometimes call this implied rules. So if you look in a game like classic D&D, there's a lot of implied rules. And what I mean by that is there will be a thing like torches, and there's things like flint and steel in the game. So there's no rule in the rule book that says you have to have this skill to be able to use flint and steel. There's no rule that says there's no rules about when you can light a torch or how you light a torch. They're just there in the equipment list. So one has to conclude, well, what would an adventurer do with flint and steel? Well, they would light a fire with it.
Right.
There's no rule that says somebody can't light a fire. There's no rules about
taking a water skin and seeing which way the water tumbles on the floor, or all that is implied. There's no rule that says you can put things in a backpack. It's a backpack. So
correct.
You put things in it.
So we have to imply a whole bunch of, we have to deduce what these rules are. We have to sort of figure out, well, what does he mean? Why is this here, and what's it for? Which allows this open system to function, because there's no specific rule saying this is how you use a flint and steel, and this is the context within which you can use that flint and steel. So now I have, as a game master, either to decide, well, is it just a routine action that the character is doing? Is it just a normal thing like lighting a simple Bic lighter, or is this a situation where the character might actually fail, and that failure might have a negative consequence?
Yeah. This makes me think of a couple of things. My co-host and I had a conversation about diegesis, like this idea that in these indie and old school games, what you know and what you would do in the world is not so separated from what the character would know or do. The character, the character would know what flint and steel is and be able to use it. A character in the world would not know what a perception check is and would not be able to use it. And
right.
So a lot of these games are more diegetic, like you're just doing what you would do in the world and interacting with the fiction. And so, okay, so you got flint and steel, and you're gonna first of all, let me frame this so that somebody that maybe they are coming from Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition or from some other game. Let's say that they do use this method, because I have heard. So this is something I have a lot of modern players do, and I'm going to give another example of this that I just had recently. And I think I have it every single time a modern player is trying out an OSR game. I think I've had it every single time with every single modern player. I'm going to give that example in a minute. But let's say, all right, they roll a d20, and a default difficulty class, which is a target number for the Dungeon Master, is 12. And you know that you want to roll a d20 to get a 12 or higher to perceive something, an active, not a passive perception where it just happens automatically, but I'm going to do a perception skill check in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. And, that say they have a +2 to perception. So they roll a d20 and they get a 10 and they add 2. Bam, I got a 12. All right, I have succeeded. And usually Dungeons & Dragons, it has like a binary outcome. You either win or you don't. You either succeed or you fail. So, all right, you have succeeded. So then I say, all right, you see in the darkness these things crawling along the ceiling, and they're leaving those slime trails you saw earlier. And so now they are able to act, and it brings them to the next decision point. And you're saying that in these games, and I want to return also to this idea that the rule isn't there. But let's say we're not going to use a rule system. You just know that there's something around there, and you maybe you have to ask. You say, well, where do the slime trails go? And I would suggest, like, the referee should just freely offer this information. Like, you shouldn't try to hide it or, conceal it behind something like, oh, it looks like they go along the walls and go up to the ceiling, or they go from the ceiling and fall along the walls. And now, okay, well, what's on the? I'm going to take a long pole and add a torch to it and hold it up to the ceiling, and then, bam, okay, now you see these slimy things crawling around. And you're saying that you would do that more in this open gaming system, that the players have to pull not so much from the rule books, but from the miasma of their experience and knowledge and all the books they've read and movies and everything else,
Yes.
Yeah, and that you're going to resolve that, and then it's going to bring you to the next decision point just as surely as if you rolled a die.
Yes, correct.
Okay. So there's a couple of things I want to bring up. One is, let's say you're playing mostly something like Basic and Expert Dungeons and Dragons, which seems to be a lot of the default basis for a lot of these fantasy adventure games nowadays. So something like BX, or it's Black Hack, or Knave, or Shadowdark, or whatever this fantasy adventure game is you're using. And you have a rule. Like they say, and so they want to use the modern approach, and they say, I want to stop and spend 10 minutes listening. And they do that constantly. Or the referee wants to do that. And they're like, well, make a listen check, make a search check. Because that exists in Basic and Expert, right? Like, you roll a d6, and you're bound to just fail, like, the vast majority of the time. Morkborg. I know somebody that did this in Morkborg, and we had like 6 characters die. Eventually we were almost about ready to just give up on the dungeon. Sometimes the rules are there. So, I mean, what about that?
So this is a thing where I think a lot of old school Renaissance, and really the original games, because I do kind of differentiate a little bit between OSR games and old school games sometimes. I think sometimes the games don't do a very good job, the texts of the games don't do a very good job of teaching the game master how to run a game.
That's true. Yeah, Old School Essentials says so up front, right? It says this will not tell you how to do a role-playing game. I think it says that in the very front.
Yeah, and I think there was a reason for that. That was back in the early days of the OSR. Basically, people assumed that the only people that were going to be interested in these games were geezers who grew up with them or started playing with them and understood how the games worked and had a good grasp on the concepts. So we didn't really need to spend the ink to do that. But I think that assumption is now incorrect, and we have a bunch of younger gamers or new gamers or people who maybe played a little bit back in the 80s but didn't really get a good introduction to the game because they were 12 years old and they were playing with other 12-year-olds, and we were a bunch of idiots and didn't quite grasp what was going on. And so there's a whole bunch of assumptions that get made about that. But I think what happens when you get a lot of times, I've seen this on Reddit a bunch of times, where you get exactly what you described, a game master who says, okay, you need to make a D6 search roll, and and spend 10 minutes doing the search, when the only time I think that's an appropriate thing to do, or using some other mechanic like that, and this is why I think this is a reason why people coming from 5th edition or modern sensibility games really struggle with old school games, is because they're trying to apply a mechanism in a way that it wasn't intended to be used. The search roll, for example, is a mechanism that's used when your characters kind of either your players have run out of ideas, or the thing that they're searching for is so well hidden or secret that it's not too easy to detect it. And I think also, just from a design standpoint, if you have something like that in a setting, or in like a dungeon room that requires a secret roll, and the only way to find it is a secret roll, that's just not a very good design method, especially if that's a bottleneck to, like, you have to go through this space in order to get through the rest of the adventure, or to get into the rest of the dungeon. I think that's just not a very good design technique. So I think what it is people are misusing a rule because they don't understand it, and that's partly on the designers and publishers, because they're not explaining it very well, of what it's for and when to use it and how to use it.
Right. Those are two things that I see happen with people coming into what is, in my experience, a old school hobby dominated by the thought of basic and expert D&D. Never mind the fact that there are other strands of DNA in classical gaming, and that seems like a dominant basis of things for me. And I see people employ the rules because they say it says you can check doors, listen, search rooms and things like that, and so they do it, and then it's just so brutal and you just fail and you just can't succeed. And I'm hearing you say that you shouldn't just employ those rules all the time. That should probably be clarified to say that's meant for something more specific, or as a kind of as something else. But this maybe is a little bit of a generalization, but maybe games that think of that more like a save. Now I'm talking about like people coming from the modern game where everything does have a check, and you can reliably, you can do that. You can rely on a check to resolve things. But
sure.
in this game, the checks are, from a modern perspective, maybe you should think of that more like a save, or more like a case, like a niche, it's not something you would do all the time.
Yes, correct. It should actually be, it's not a routine activity. Runesinger, I wish I could remember what the title of the video was. He was talking about this on a YouTube video recently, where he was bringing up a bit of text from Chaosium's Call of Cthulhu 6th edition. I'm not sure if this is in the 7th edition text or not, but it states very clearly that you only need to do a roll for a situation when it's not routine. So you have skills in Call of Cthulhu, like use library. Right.
But Lord have mercy, you should not have to like go and use that to pick up a book and look at it. I mean,
yes, or to find a book in the library.
Yeah.
Or to go through the card catalog and find oh, I need this specific book, or I need a book that has this something about this topic. Oh, it's in the restricted area. You'll have to go talk to the restricted area librarian and get permission to go in there, and then find the specific book. And then can you use a table of contents and an index? Those are the only time where library use becomes particularly where actually rolling dice to see if you actually do find the material you're looking for is when something is so completely obscure or weird or unusual that you really have to have a character that knows how to use the more complicated elements of the library, or where to go, where to even look at to go find something specific that they need.
Does that explain why the thief in most old school games, both in once OD&D introduced the thief and also in BXD&D and those kind of two DNA strands, does that explain why the thief is so perilously inept at their skills? Like, if you just expected the thief to do everything on their thief skill list from the get-go, they would die to the first poison trap.
Whether it was a conscious design choice, which I suspect it was up to a degree, I'm not entirely sure what the design choice was, intent was behind it, but from a, I guess, observational descriptive perspective, that's what it is. If a character tries to do something at low levels, there's a pretty good chance they're going to fail. I think one way a lot of people describe it, or at least interpret it, is that if you're looking at say a sheer surface, a non-thief character would have a 0% chance of climbing it.
Because this says sheer surface, like that is
Right.
something very special. And I guess that's what I
Right.
mean is like, hey, this is very special. Like, this isn't just, routinely climbing something.
Right. Yeah. This isn't climbing a ladder. This isn't going up a rope that's securely fixed to an anchor point. This is there's fingertip holds, and you'd need Alex Honnold to have a 100% chance of climbing up this thing. It's a really difficult climb. And then, at least the way I run it, is if the character has tools of some sort, uses spikes, uses a grappling hook or something like that to help steady themselves, either the tool makes the thing 100%, yeah, you can do that, or it increases the chances that they can manage it without falling. And again, we go back to the diegetic sort of approach. If the player can say, well, I'm going to do this, this, and this, depending on how creative they get with their solution to the problem, I might either say, yeah, you do it, and up you go, or I might give them, well, you're still 75% chance of doing that, but there's still a small chance that you might fail.
Yeah, now that seems like an interesting part of this too, because these are kind of some observations I've seen of modern either dungeon masters or players, and they're trying out one of these, an indie system or an older system, a classical system. And so another thing that I see is a propensity to either say no, even though that is not in the school of thought of like neo-trad gaming. Like, you're supposed to say yes as much as possible, but a propensity to say no, or to provide a mechanical filter, to try to say, well, you can do it, but now there's this type of check. And it sounds like this type of gaming in an open gaming concept actually could free referees actually to say yes a lot, because if the players, like, again, we're in the hallway, you see the slime trails, and they ask a question about the slime trails. If they just connect to that, if they just pull on that thread, and they say something like, how fresh are the slime trails? If that's the first thing that comes to mind, you could say very fresh, right? And okay, so it seems like it's here right now. This wasn't 50 years ago. Or if they say, what direction do they go? Oh, up to the ceiling. Well, then they're going to look at the ceiling, and you can just give the information freely. You don't, or if there is some sort of, if it is less clear or more difficult, then eventually you'll get to that mechanic. But it sounds like this is more of a yes system, actually.
Well, for me it is, and there are different game masters have different approaches and different interpretations and different methods. And I've seen old-timey DMs be very strict on these things, and I've seen old-timey DMs be very generous on these sorts of things. So it is a certain amount of variation, which was one of the things that the third edition game designers were trying to get away from. They were trying to make a game that was very player directed, very player focused on mechanisms, where players would think in terms of mechanism and go have a robust rule set that would tell them the probability of what was going to happen before they even told the game master what they were doing. And a lot of it was because there were just bad game masters. And one of the designers on third edition was Skip Williams, who spent years being the question answerer in the Dragon magazine. I forget is it Sage something?
Sage advice column.
Sage advice column, yeah. And he would get hundreds of these letters about bad game mastering takes.
Oh wow!
And the thing is that was a bit of it was an easy thing to get selection bias, because most people weren't going to send TSR a letter saying, hey, we had this weird thing come up last week and our game master made a really good ruling about it, and we all agreed with it, and he said yes, and we moved on. Like nobody's writing Skip Williams a letter and telling him, hey, this game is great, or this method of DMing is great, thanks.
Yeah.
They're going to send letters when they're irritated or upset with their game master, or the game master isn't sure what to do about a situation, just because they didn't have very good or they weren't very experienced with the game. So that would give you this idea that, there's thousands and tens of thousands of game masters out there screwing it up, so we better give them a rule so they don't, so that the player's experience is predictable.
Yeah, now this brings up actually another interesting point about this, and this is something else I've observed that happens, is you said this depends on common sense, this depends on the ideas, the fictional imagination that players and the referee already bring to the table, movies and cinema and books and comic books and video games and common everyday experience and what would work, and you can adjudicate things using that, and that sounds really intimidating. And I think if someone listening to that coming from the modern game right now, they would say, wow, this sounds like it would be tough to referee. And something I've seen is, going back to the example of you're in the hallway and all right, they decide they're going to try to use what they have to lift something up and raise it to the ceiling, and in like a torch, to see if they can both see or see if the torch will interact with the slime, and see what happens. They find a way to safely poke at it, and invariably I've seen players. I haven't seen referees do this much, because referees usually are focused on, even modern ones, how do I get them to the next point where they can make a decision. I think that's something the old and new school have in common. So but the players will sometimes be like, well, what do we have that we didn't bring a 10-foot pole? Is there a stick nearby? What if we have this spear? The spear is it's like this one's 5 feet long. Well, is that long enough? Do I need 2 spears? Can I tie the 2 spears together? Do I have I've heard the details, the granularity go down as far as, is my flint and steel wet, and how much, and then I think usually a referee, it seems to me that the key for this to work as well isn't just the shared fiction, but a referee that has the skill to frame that fiction, to make actions and choices, and to pare that down through communication and say, no, don't worry about that. Your flint still is fine. You can reach it with a spear. You can put the torch on the end of the spear. And they're like, okay, well, we do that. And then you get to the next decision point. And if something's unclear, you either you disambiguate it, you make it less ambiguous, you provide choices if something's unclear, or you ask, well, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to get it up to the ceiling? Oh, okay, yeah, you can do that. You've got what you need for that. And you continually communicate, and that communication provides the ability to make choices. Because in this completely open gaming concept where there's no buttons to push, that can be unclear. Like they don't know. I've encountered that a lot with new players.
Yeah, what I do a lot of times, if I have a player where it seems like I haven't quite, because a lot of times, game masters get a little ego driven, I think maybe, or they want to play this game of gotcha.
Yeah.
I try to, and this is just my personal perspective on this, I try to make sure that players are very clear about what is in front of their characters, and if and it really depends on who I'm playing with. If it's a group of new people, or if it's a group of people who've only played more recent games and they don't quite seem to get the concept yet, I will say, hey, okay, I'll tell them, hey, you've got a couple options here, and here's a few things that you could possibly do.
Yeah.
Or
not that you're limited to those things, but yeah,
right. Not that you're limited, but here's a couple ideas, or I will restate the situation and the decisions that are in front of them in a more succinct way. Because you might have a 5-minute conversation back and forth about what they're seeing and what's going on in front of them, and if they seem like they're sort of stuck, I'll go ahead and say, hey, okay, let me just run down what's in front of you one more time so that we make sure that we're on the same page, because we don't have, we're not in a hologram or a perfect simulation. We're in I'm talking to you, and the image that's in my head might not be the same image. It's almost certainly not the same image that's in your head. So I have to make sure all the salient details are clear to you. And then once I feel confident that the player has a real clear view of what is going on and what is actually important that's in front of them, then I'll sort of step back and say, so what do you want to do?
Yeah. It seems to me that in order for this to work, that seems very important. And maybe don't have like 20 details, like have within what our minds are, without becoming saturated, where we start shedding details that we're trying to understand, provide absolutely no more than 12, I think is like the, but
I think
really just
3 to 5 is really,
yeah.
Where I have ADHD, so trying to hold more than 3 to 5 things in my head at one time is difficult to begin with. But I read a little bit of pop psychology and stuff like that, or just trade books written by psychologists, and the modern current neuroscience that I've read says 3 to 5 points of choice or ideas is really kind of the limit of what you can hold in your head at any one given time, and really sort of incorporate all that stuff together. I think the simpler you can make things, the better you are, because it's already complex. There's no sense in making it more complicated.
Yeah, that seems like just good advice, OSR or not. And another
Yes.
thing that my co-host and I talked about that's key, that also just seems like I also, if we have time, I dug into this too much. I dug too greedily and too deep, and I don't know
It's
if I'm
okay,
gonna.
I have time.
I don't know if I'm gonna get to the second topic, but we talked about this idea of apophenia and how you can rely on the mind's ability to fill in gaps. And in fact, the mind seems to work that way more than actually trying to provide details. That really our mind works on filling in these details. And that's what gives us a picture of the world. And so, like in one of these adventures, they don't give you all the details of a room. They give you a couple of sensations when you enter the room. The beach is sandy, soft white sand. The lake is underground, cool, sparkling water. And then that's about it. Maybe one or two more. And then it's time to move on to the things to press in that place to investigate.
Yeah, I think it's really just a matter of identifying what's important.
Yeah, and then usually these things are
the
tied to telegraphing something that will tell you what's about to...
what's the salient detail? I mean, because you read most dungeon, they don't tell you, well, this is an igneous rock that was formed 5 million years ago.
Oh, I've seen some.
But I mean, you get some of that, but and sometimes that's important. Like I played in a convention game, and the tunnel was a form of like volcanic glass, and that had an effect on the magic that you could cast in there.
Okay. Yeah. I mean,
but that's a salient detail, and
right.
That's really what it comes down to: is what's the salient detail that I need to have in order to communicate what the objective and the obstacles are in this particular encounter that allows the players to make a choice.
Yeah. So that there are not too many details. The details are actually actionable, something that could be used. Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, maybe it's useful to define the space in general terms. You're in a forest. I know that sounds silly, but I just talked to Hexpress, and we were kind of talking about how it's possible in a sandbox you need to let people know they're in the forest. You don't need to let them know that it's a coniferous forest with the pine needles aging, and it appears as if something has maybe rotted the soil. If that's disconnected from anything that they can act on, then they're going to go investigate those pine needles for a 3-hour watch, and it's not going to make any sense. And it's going to be disconnected from... You can just be, you're in a forest. And then
right.
You can give the details that matter. All right, this open system, we talked about diegetic elements. Hey, you have something in your inventory. You have flint and steel. You have a spear, a rod, a 10-foot pole. You could try to attach a torch. You can try to send something ahead, you said. Maybe if you've negotiated with one of the denizens of the place for enough coin, they'll go and investigate it and take the brunt of some of the danger for you. Something that's actually in the fiction rather than an ability or a mechanic or something like that. I wanted to present another situation that I have come up almost every time. Almost every time a modern gamer or a gamer coming from the brand game comes over to and just trying out an old school game or an indie game. And this is something in the realm of the mind and the difference between the character and the player. I wanted to get your thoughts on this. This is similar to a situation I just had. I always have this, though, every single time someone tries out an old school game. So let's say we're further ahead in the dungeon of the incandescent grottos, and you're toward the end where kind of a significant monster's lair is. And it says that there is this... the cavern opens up into this underground stream, and there's a bridge that crosses over onto an island in an underground lake. And if you go out onto this island that's about 20 feet across, it says that there is a coffer in the center of it, and nearby, starting as a bloated corpse, something arises. It says it has oozing pustules, purple robes, and gold jewelry with 3 eyes. And it's this like ooze priest, you know, and it presents itself as like this holy priestess of the ooze. And every time, without fail, I'll have a modern gamer say, "Can I make some kind of roll or history check to know anything about the ooze?" And I do something blasphemous. I say, "No, no, you cannot." That's an interesting situation I encounter because, in the modern game you have the history skill, Arcana. What else would it be? But you have these sort of things that represent the power, the capabilities of the mind of the character, and you can activate those abilities to try to resolve that situation. But here, if we have the open gaming concept, if they've never heard of ooze, and they've never read a fairy tale book about ooze, or anything, like where's that even come from in fiction? Where they've never watched, what is that, The Blob, or one of those pop fiction kind of things about oozes? What would they know? They wouldn't know anything, right? So then what do you do,
It depends on the situation. For at least the way I do it, if it's something where that's totally absolutely bizarre, that's where their character couldn't have possibly known anything about it, then I will tell them that their character simply doesn't know. If the monster is very common in the setting, so let's say there's goblins in my setting, and goblins are that even your average peasant has come across goblins, then your average peasant is going to have all kinds of stories, rumors, folklore, all that sort of thing about goblins. And I might give a brief bit of information, like, well, there's all kinds of stories about it. They say that goblins emerge from improperly dealt with trash, whatever it happens to be, and that if you sprinkle salt on them, they'll die. I mean, whatever I think, whatever I've created for that setting. If it is something that's more obscure, like let's say dragon lore, but you take like a wizard who might possibly have, picked up one of his master's tomes and read it as part of his education, or if let's say a priest or a cleric character is coming up against something unholy, which we presume that the reason they're out adventuring is that they were sent out by their church to deal with the unholy and terrible manifestations of chaos in the universe, then I might give them a roll under your wisdom or roll under your intelligence to get a bit of knowledge. But that's just me, and I don't know. I don't think there's a general consensus about how to handle something like that.
Right.
My general is either you know something about it because everybody knows something about it. Kind of like the way...
That's true, too. It could be possible your character could know something you don't because they are a medieval fantasy adventurer and you're just not. So maybe you just know something. They just know something. That's true.
Right. Like there's the folklore about tying bells to your tennis shoes if you're going to go out someplace where there's bears. And then and then you'll know that there are bears in the area when you find bear scat with bells in it.
Huh. Yeah.
Kind of deal. There's all these little, we have, urban folklore about all kinds of things in the real world, and there's no reason why a fantasy, medieval pseudo world wouldn't have similar sorts of those things, especially around things that are common. If you know that there's such a thing as werewolves, well, most people in the setting, we all have heard stories about using silver to kill a werewolf, or putting a stake through a vampire's heart to kill it. So there's no reason why an adventurer would be completely ignorant of a monster that they're facing if it's a fairly common monster in the setting.
Yeah, and to try to create two poles to this, you noted that there are different approaches to this, and that seems true even among indie and old school games. In that, on one hand, you have people. It makes me think of like the Axe people and the simulationist renaissance, where a big part of why they're playing the game at all is to create a rationalistic framework of real things, a truth to everything, because they desire and enjoy that. So if they're investigating dragons, there'll be books on dragons, there'll be mechanics about dragons, there'll be every kind of atom related to a dragon, and it's totally up to the players how they want to pick those atoms apart and discover it. And that's a joy that they experience in that. And then opposite of that, and this is maybe a little more where I am a lot of times, is there's the modern game often assumes a rationalist framework for a fantasy world. And there's all sorts of things that kind of come out of that. And to me, a lot of times what these classical games provide is a sense of a liminal dream state, especially when you go in the underworld, which, I like caving. I used to do a lot of caving. When you go in a cave, your vestibular system says, what are you doing? Where are you? And it starts freaking out. And the human mind actually starts messing. You start getting messed with your own mind underground. There is this primal archetypal quality to descending beneath the earth, that we've had for thousands of years. And these old games provide that. And I wrote a blog article. The title's bad, I know, but it's called The Myth of OSR Lethality. And yes, it's lethal, of course, having one hit point. But I have observed that when you end up playing in the way that you've been describing, that one hit point character usually doesn't die, in my experience. They actually don't die.
Yeah, that's correct.
But what that one hit point does in our mind is it provides the opportunity to be the person, to be the child where something is under the bed. And in that space, so right. There's something to be said about like actually just you don't know, and that you can have a game, an adventure, where to me like that's a whole part of the adventure is this sense of there is something in the shadows. There's something that's never completely revealing itself. There's something. That's kind of like the fairy tale genre. These are things that burble up from our primal mind, and you get to kind of interact with those things. So there's a fun to me in not knowing as well.
Yeah. I think there's it's really, one of the reasons I don't like the more modern game is it tries to categorize, define, describe, and give an origin story and a set description to everything.
Yeah, you've got a small creature, a medium creature. Is it a creature at all? Or is it a humanoid? Is it this type of creature? And everything has a taxonomy. And interestingly, the characters don't even share that taxonomy. Like they would not even know what any of that is.
Yeah, and so there's this, you get these huge entries for monsters with like this big history and a background, and this god created them as servitors, and they achieved some sort of freedom when this thing happened. I mean, there's like this huge whole backstory to them, and it constrains, or at least it encourages the game master to be constrained onto what the designer has given them, rather than going, I don't know.
Yeah, I had that experience last night before last, because they were in a cave, and there were what are those things called? The things that fall from stalactites.
Piercers.
Piercers. There were piercers, and I didn't say there are piercers. I said that you're in this cave, and there are stalagmites and stalactites and pools, and of the stalactites you can see. I'm more on the end of just like completely offering the information a bit, and then just you do whatever you want with it. And I don't propose any way that anyone would ever solve a puzzle, and then they always end up solving it anyway. So that's a lot of fun for me. But the stalactites, most of them have a rock formation. You see among 4 stalactites that there is a brown, murky, muddy quality with a goop that drips from the end of them down into the dark pool below. So I give that primal mind like, whoa, why are these 4 stalactites different? And that there's this creature. And one of the players was like, well, I know what that is. I don't know if my character would know what that is, because he played a lot of AD&D. So he's like,
Yeah.
oh, I know what that is. But then I end up presenting them in the wild in a way that maybe is different, because AD&D often goes into details as you just described. So I will end up just describing a hobgoblin in a way that is just some uncomfortable thing that you don't know out in the wilderness. And maybe it's a hobgoblin, maybe it's a troll, and it's never clear. And I'm never going to call them a troll or a hobgoblin, because your character wouldn't even know what it is.
Yeah, I kind of go back and forth on that. It kind of depends, because if your characters have encountered ghouls 5 times already,
that's true too. Yeah, then that's at that point. Yeah,
and you go, you see a pale clawed.
They usually end up coming up with their own
humanoid.
names, so that's fun.
Yeah, they do that. If it's. And the player goes, was it like the other 4 times we encountered ghouls?
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Go, it's a, so sometimes it's sometimes just a time saver just to go, you see there's 2 ghouls consuming a corpse near the in the graveyard, and you go, okay, yeah, we know what to do about that.
Absolutely.
We have a plan for that. So we want a single set of prescriptive tools that this is what you always do in this thing always. And I've certainly been that way before, and more my answer to all questions in RPGs is it depends ...
Yeah. I say that's my number 2 axiom. Like the number 2 thing you get to is it depends. I agree. So I had this situation. So what you described, where you have like the 5th edition, this whole body of information, which I used to love. I used to pore over those things. I mean, I still enjoy things like lore.
They're fun to read.
Yes, they're fun to read. But not only does it constrain the expectations that would come from the dungeon master, but the other interesting effect is that it creates a problem that maybe wouldn't have been there. This is my observation, which is that, that the communication part to me seems critical to this open gaming concept working, where if something's unclear, you get to the next, all right, well, what's your intention? Or, oh, I left out this detail. And you continue this back and forth communication of what the situation is as necessary so that they can actually act on the situation. Because there are all sorts of problems that I used to deal with when I ran 5th edition that I no longer have. And one of them was the specter of metagaming. There was this constant specter of what do I know versus what does my character know? Because oftentimes players have this system mastery. or this lore mastery where they will know reams and reams of information across texts, and they'll know all this kind of stuff. And all those expectations exist, and they have to strain to say, all right, I am not that, and they have to separate themselves from that. And an interesting thing I've observed in the old school is a lot of times don't have to do that, and you can end up committing that cardinal sin of metagaming, and it actually works great because what you would know is sometimes what your character would know. Like we're running Classic Traveler, and one of the travelers, they're in this situation where they're trying to help a Space Viking crew, a captain, get his ship back, and the crew is split into these factions in this irradiated waste, and they're all fighting over the ship. So they're trying to play the factions against one another and unite different factions and this kind of stuff. Well, one of the players knows a lot about like the prose edda and the poetic and like Norse lore, right? And at one point, kind of tentatively was like, can I use that? And to me, at least in that situation, I'm like, heck yes, you can use that. And they constructed all these clever solutions using their knowledge of like the Norse language and Norse culture and stuff.
Right.
And that wouldn't be possible in a modern game where you have this big body of lore upon which everything kind of rests. You can delve even deeper into that open gaming concept and use things that wouldn't exist there in the book otherwise.
Yep, you sure can.
Yeah, I have ran out of. I couldn't get to the second topic, but that's okay.
If you have time, I'm more than happy to indulge you. If you want to do more, I have some time this afternoon.
Yeah, and I appreciate that very much. I suppose we probably can't get to the second topic, but what I did want to at least finish out with is, since we've framed a lot of this in terms of like, hey, I've presented my observations of new people that they start out in old school Renaissance games or they come from the brand game. But we've been talking about things in terms of what does this open gaming concept look like, and what are some situations where maybe that could be misunderstood or we could help people understand it. I want to zoom out. So this is kind of like my last question would be, apart from this open gaming concept, you called it a key to understanding the old school Renaissance. If that's the case, what are the other keys? What is key 2 and 3, if that's the case? Like, what are the things what's step 1, 2, and 3 if somebody's coming from Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition and they're going to try out Shadowdark tomorrow, or they're going to try out Morkborg?
Well, I guess I wouldn't. I'm not. So Morkborg and Shadowdark and Knave and Cairn.
Modern post-OSR for sure. I know. But.
Yeah, some of those games I'm not. I've read them. I haven't run them or even really played many of them very much. And so from my perspective, I sort of have begun differentiating between old school and OSR.
Yeah,
and
I agree. Yeah.
And to me, old school means, can I keep on the Borderlands and run this without changing it?
Yeah, that's what I'm going to pitch tonight is probably this with Shadowdark.
Or
and you have to change it. That's true.
Or can I run an adventure like Winter's Daughter using basic or OD&D without doing any changes? Yes. Okay, so that to me is an old school game. OSR has become a set of somewhat vague and ever-changing principles that usually starts with rules, not rulings, and there even sometimes I think people disagree what that means exactly.
Certainly.
So my personal perspective on what are the keys to getting old school play are firstly understanding this concept of an open game where the conceptual framework of the setting or the diegesis or whatever you want to, or the mental construct or the theater of the mind or whatever you want to call it, is the primary interactive tool that the players use to make decisions about what their characters are doing. That is the very first thing that you really have to understand, because if you try to run an old school game, and I don't care whether it's an OSR game or what I could truly consider an old school game, both of those have this basic concept of focusing on playing the world rather than playing the game, where the setting and the world and what's going on in front of your character is more important than what's on your character sheet most of the time. It's not to say that the character sheet or the mechanics of the game are not important, or that the game master should not use them, because that's another way I think rules not rulings, or rulings not rules, gets misinterpreted, is that what we're doing is completely ignoring the rules. There are plenty of ways in which the rules should be used when things that are in the rules, and we've all decided that we're going to use this rule set, and we go, okay, I have rolled a random encounter, and the procedure is that I roll for surprise, I roll for encounter distance. In this particular case, I'm going to roll a reaction roll, because these are humanoid characters with some sentience to them, and they may not decide that they don't want to attack right away. So I follow that procedure. I follow that set of rules. So I follow the rules when it is appropriate to follow the rules, and when I don't, and when there is no rule, or the existing rules insufficient, then I go back to a ruling, which is based on the implied rules of the game. Oh, I have flint and tinder, so I can use them. Or my common sense and general knowledge of our real world and the kind of setting and experience I'm trying to produce in this world. So there's a sort of a holistic sort of thinking that goes on about it. It's not just, you can't just apply one thing and expect it to work well. It's a whole set of things, all applied equally, specific to the situation. So that's the first thing, is that open setting kind of framework of placing the world before the rules, but still applying the rules when you need them. The second part is, I think, for somebody who really wants to have an old school game experience, is that you actually need to use an old school system. I think Shadow Dark and Cairn and Knave and all these game systems are nice. They're perfectly good games. They also are slightly different in important ways. They have, some of them have unified mechanisms, and I do think mechanisms matter. I used to be, it's completely mindset, and I think that's not quite true, because I think mechanisms do impact the game in specific ways. Some of those rule sets do things like removing encumbrance and movement, and taking care of things like how many arrows do I have, with the usage die, those sort of things, that I think is not necessarily as this. I think that changes the experience, maybe not in easily observable ways, but when you actually have a moment where having a character pay attention to whether or not they replenish their arrows in town is a different experience than rolling a d8 to see if you rolled a 1 this time.
Yeah, no, that. So I think I agree with you. I think I've seen this. I'm fairly new, by the way, like old school gaming. So I was a dungeon master and like a forever DM in 5th edition for like 6 years, and then never found the kind of game I really wanted. I wanted a game that had a sense of like being this big open world, like Lord of the Rings, and you could go on a journey. You could go on this adventure, and it wasn't clearly defined. I wanted this sense of being this muddy-booted adventure that had a reason to return to town, and I never had that. Eventually, there's a point of no return in the modern game after the 2nd or 3rd level, really after the third level, where you never get to go back, and you are now the center of the world and the main character of a story. And I never enjoyed that as a player, and I discovered that in the OSR broadly.
Yeah.
And I
Well, that is one of the things that to me characterizes old school games, is that using High Gygaxian, I call it milieu centricity, which basically just means that the characters are not the center of the world, or there is the setting is the important piece,
yeah.
and that so for a time period the players and the DM have zoomed in on this particular group of characters, but you could easily zoom out to another group of characters or a different mix of characters.
Yeah. Now, I've observed something that you're saying as I've interacted with the Shadowdark community in particular as an example. And the reason I bring that up, I actually had a similar conversation with Matt Finch, where he made a similar distinction. He said, "Wait, hold on. There's an important difference here. It's not to say that Shadowdark is just not an old school game. And when they say old school, they mean that spectrum of design principles is what they're talking about, like from Principia Apocrypha. So you've got elements of design, right? That's what they're saying when they say old school, and that it does have some things in common with classical gaming. But one of the things I've observed is oftentimes I think, man, these people would be better served if they actually just read the basic set from 1981 and actually tried discovering why it matters that there's a long corridor going nowhere. We had that experience in B4, where we used the rules from Basic and Expert D&D in B4 in a Theater of the Mind dungeon crawl, and suddenly it became a perilous consequence of their combined decisions underground at level 3 when they were not able to take a rest after an hour in the dungeon, were running out of light, had closed off one pathway for a monster from one end, and then had fled in an evasion a monster in another encounter back onto the same monster because they didn't map. And there were all these things that came together that you can't see unless you actually try it out and you actually do that. And I've observed, man, these people should actually just try classical gaming. This would be a good thing, even if it's not for you. And I call it classical, or maybe a whole term for me is classical adventure gaming, or classical
that's
adventure
usually what I
fantasy
say.
Gaming, which maybe isn't even role playing. It doesn't. For me, it usually is. And we play a game on Mondays. I use Swords and Wizardry, and then but the authoritative ideas come from the 3 Little Brown Books, and then that DNA strand that continues up to the 1E DMG, and that Gygaxian campaign milieu is the goal. And when I talked to Matt Finch about this, that first point that you said about you need to understand this type of world. You have to understand this world for this to work. The best we could come up with is this actually maybe takes mentorship. Like you might actually need to play in a game with a group of other people, because there's nothing in the text that's going to tell you exactly this is where you need to put down iron spikes in a door. If you do that, it's going to create this noise. Nothing's going to teach you dungeoneering, except you need to roll with people that already know how to do it. It's almost like
there are ways of learning it. I mean, because you got to remember that somebody did figure this out before.
Yeah.
Through trial and error, and
that's
then
true too,
trading and trading stories. Gary and Rob and Ernie sat at the table with Dave Arneson in Gary's kitchen, and with Dave Meggery, and even there, it was because Dave Meggery had all these experiences from Blackmore of going, I think we should maybe avoid this wizard because I think he's going to be in trouble. I don't think we should taunt this wizard. It would be a bad idea. Well, they did, and it was not a good outcome. But you could certainly, people can figure it out.
Yeah.
there is a much faster learning curve if certainly for a game master, because this is a thing that I've thought about doing as um, a recorded game kind of situation where as a tutorial for game masters of running an adventure and putting out a PDF. Here's the adventure or the dungeon that I'm running. Here are my notes from it. Here's a video of play, and then
Yeah, that'd be great.
after each encounter, do a commentary.
That'd be awesome.
Or have
that'd be great.
have a version of it where we just here it is, the straight playthrough, and then the second version of it of okay, here's my commentary of as the DM of what's going on and why I told them this specific thing and how I adjudicated this and why I adjudicated it the way I did, and where you take an hour of gameplay and maybe turn it into 2 hours with a commentary, because there's a whole bunch of, even if you watch an actual play video, there's a whole bunch of stuff that the DM is thinking but not saying.
Yeah.
And it's not particularly clear sometimes as to why a DM made a certain choice over another choice, and having that information would be, I think, helpful to somebody that's new at it to go, oh, I see the principle here, so that once they understand the principle, they can apply it in different situations.
Yeah, that would be amazing, and I think your blog in particular, your video blog, I think either would be great. By the way, like if it were written with pictures and step by step, that would be really useful and easy to parse. Like you could kind of go down it. Alternately, if you did a video blog, that would be great. But your blog in particular would be really ideal for that, because what I see as your format is very digestible, very systematic, very direct, very clear presentation of what are very deep and complicated things. Because I see people get real complicated with this stuff, and it's not doing us any favors of trying to help, especially if somebody's trying to learn the classical adventure gaming style of play. I don't know if you'd agree, but I think it is a challenge. And that's what we came up with Matt Finch. That's kind of what he said. He was like, look, you're just going to have to work, and that's not a bad thing. Like, you're going to have to try to learn, and that's a good, and it can be fun too. And making the mistakes can be part of the fun. I guess even it's almost kind of a joy that, like, you all that have been doing it for a long time, you have this experience, and somebody's new at it, they're going to make mistakes, and they get to have that journey too, in a way. They get to they get to also learn and make mistakes, and
so I pay attention a little bit, just a tiny bit, to a local Facebook group for D&D, and it's pretty much almost all 5e players on that Facebook group. And a thing I notice, which I find a little sad, and I wrote about this a little bit on my most recent newsletter from last month, that there is this anxiety that a lot of particularly young 5e players have about screwing up, and 5e DMs have about screwing up. Like, this is not a simple hobby. It's not easy in the sense that you can just figure it out in your first time through and have it 100% correct all the time. I've been doing this for a long time, and I screw up calls. I think something is going to go a certain way, and it doesn't. It happens. And so there's this sort of fear of failure or fear of disappointing the people playing at the table, or even in players are afraid of disappointing other players because they don't know how to play the game the right way, whatever that happens to be, which I personally find just is a real bummer, because when I learned how to play, I had never played the game before. I had never played any RPG before. I didn't have any concept of what it was. I just showed up. They told me how to create a character. and we played, and we had a good time. It was kind of a silly concept. It was a little weird. I couldn't tell you if the DM got anything right or not. Or if they but we had fun and we had a really good time. And if there's anything I could say to new 5e or people coming from 5e to this version of D&D is that it's not an easy thing. It requires effort, and the more time and thought you put into it, the better you're going to be at it. But you are going to make errors, and that's okay. It's fine. You're still going to have a good time.
I wonder if even sometimes, because it depends, right? Like I know it doesn't look like it right now, but professionally I'm an airline pilot. That's a profession where you can't screw up.
Right.
Like there are some things where it's like, no, actually don't make errors, actually, right? But in this space, so especially talking about this open gaming concept, maybe that actually adds some spice that you couldn't have. Like that's actually maybe kind of a feature almost. It makes me think of like Bethesda video games where something can emerge from it in the cracks of things that if it weren't a little wild and loose and expansive and a lot going on and if it weren't for that, you couldn't have a lot of really interesting moments that emerge. And you can have a referee who makes a mistake, and if you have a willingness to, you don't have things that are so sacred like the fact that a character dies, the world will continue and the story will continue, and that can be more resilient and durable than I really need to make sure I get this right, or the character could die, and various other things like that. Then those mistakes can actually be part of the spice. Like it could actually be even.
The musician Brian Eno pointed out a long time ago that that as new technologies emerge for making music, it's their flaws or weirdness that sort of define them, and not the things that they do well or that they do correctly.
Yeah, interesting.
Sometimes I've heard some people when they first got synthesizers back in the 70s and 80s, they threw away the manual and just started playing with the knobs and figure, what can I do with this? Like electric guitars. When electric guitars were first created, distortion was a bad thing.
Oh yeah.
Right? Like when you were playing an electric guitar, you were trying to avoid distortion. So you would fiddle with the knob depending on the space you were in. And then somebody said, well, what if we turn the gain knob all the way up and see what happens? Oh, that sounds pretty cool. Let's just play it like that.
Yeah.
So sometimes doing something that is quote unquote wrong actually ends up creating something new and interesting that you end up really liking and enjoying and going, oh, we've actually done something. We've taken the thing and we've transformed it. But if you're playing in a game where everything is described, constrained, it has to be this way, or it's wrong, then what you get is something that has no space to grow. Where one of the jokes I make about Swords and Wizardry is that the best thing about Swords and Wizardry is that it's very open and wide open to your interpretation, and the worst thing about Swords and Wizardry is it's wide open to your interpretation, because sometimes that gets a little overwhelming. But but I think it's generally speaking a good thing that it is wide open.
Yeah, I do. I adore that about Swords and Wizardry. Is like I have one of my players is also a Swords and Wizardry referee, and we look at something that will come up like magical research or spells and all kinds of stuff will come up, and he'll be like, this is the way I interpret it, and he accepts my adjudication as the referee, and I'll be like, well, this is the way I would. And we love both, and I would love to play in his game, and he likes playing in my game, and the things that come out of it, actually, we both really enjoy. We don't look at the other ruling and be like, your ruling is different, I don't like it. we look at a different ruling and be like, oh, that's cool, that's a different ruling, and we really enjoy it.
Yeah, I've been playing with the notion of making my next sandbox campaign a Swords and Wizardry campaign, and acting as if time had stopped in 1977, where I didn't have AD&D to lean on, I didn't have anything else to lean on, where all I have is just what's in that book, and I'm making it up from there.
Yeah, I did that with Classic Traveler, and I love it. Like I have a purposeful ignorance, and I don't want it to stop there. I want to grow and learn and go on. But I knew going in that I didn't know, right? So I was like, hey, I have an opportunity to actually enjoy this journey, like to actually,
Right.
you know. Whereas where you all maybe already know, like I got to come to Classic Traveler and be like, I don't know, and so I started with just this facsimile reprint book, and I was just like, I'm just gonna see what happens if we do what it says. and it's been a lot of fun, and it's been full of mistakes, like full of mistakes, and it's just been a lot of fun though. Anyways, I have taken a lot of your time, Travis. I love talking about this with you. And I've really enjoyed your blog. It's been very helpful to me and a lot of people in our play club. What other projects or videos, do you have anything coming up that you want to tell us about? And
I'm working on a what I'm calling a sandbox kernel, or it's basically a sandbox. It's just about finished. I was actually working on some maps for it this morning. It is called Hogwater Village of Lies, and it is a bottom-up sandbox setup. So it's a village, home-based village with interesting NPCs and some simple layers, a couple small micro adventures that you could do in 2 to 4 hours included in it. And it's basically just a setup for you to drop your own adventures into, or things that you've bought, whatever you want, that runs off the implied setting of being on a borderland village run by a retired adventurer, and all these different characters, these different factions in and around the town who have competing interests, and how those interests could either bring the town up or destroy it, depending on which faction the party tries to engage with or not engage with. And it's just a sort of starting place for somebody who's not particularly, who either just needs a basic vanilla with chocolate chunks medieval fantasy setting, or somebody who doesn't really know how to build a starting sandbox to look at it as a sort of an example. It's built on a sandbox that I ran and started in the village of Hogwater that ran for a couple years. So it's a basic thing I'm doing. I'm also working on a series of videos about how to build a sandbox, my process for doing that, because there's a bunch of different methods of doing it, and my general approach to my blog and my videos has always been to only really write about things that people either aren't writing about, or from a perspective that they aren't writing about. There's really no point in me in regurgitating the standard here's how you build a sandbox, but my method has some weirdness to it that others don't have. Same way about how I did a couple videos about how I design adventures and encounters for adventures in my games. That video is on my YouTube channel already.
Yeah.
And that's a slightly different perspective and technique than a lot of people use. And my sandbox is actually a sort of expansion. My sandbox process is sort of an expansion of my encounter and adventure design techniques. So those are things that I'm working on, and hopefully they will be done sooner rather than later. The Hogwater project has taken way too long, longer than I wanted it to take, but it's nearly finished. So all the writing, most of all the writing is done. I need to do like keys for some of the maps, but other than that, it's like at 50,000 words, pretty close to that at the moment. So that'll be coming out print on demand before long.
Cool. Okay, so I'm going to include a link in the description to the Grumpy Wizard blog, the written blog, and also your video blog.
I have a monthly newsletter that I publish. There's a link to that in the sidebar. If you sign up for that, there's a archive of essays that do not appear on my blog at all. In a Dropbox, or it's a Google Drive. You get a link to that when you sign up to the newsletter, and then I send out the newsletter once a month. Sandbox process in there. I have a big long essay about running high-level old-school games. Some other more general ideas about creativity. Some stuff about there's sort of a mixed bag of things in there. Sometimes I do quick reviews about bands I've gone to see, that sort of thing.
Very cool. Awesome. Well, I will include links to your blogs in the description. Travis, thank you very much for coming and talking to us.
You're very welcome. If you'd like me to come back and talk about sandboxes, I'd be happy to do that.
Awesome. Mythic Mountains RPG is a private online play club that focuses on folk RPGs. Folk RPGs are the games that belong to all of us. They're what actually happens at a table between friends. It's their voice that has the authority on what is fun and what works for them. Weekly, we upload our games to allow others to sit in with us. The channel isn't monetized. We don't own the artwork, music, software, or games shown in these actual plays, and you can find links to their authors in the description. Like, subscribe, and share if you wish, or don't. Just like games in person, you're welcome to pull up a chair, sit in, and watch some of our games. No performances, no fancy equipment, just regular people playing folk pencil and paper role-playing games and having a good time. We hope these games will prove a source of enjoyment to anyone just wanting to listen in, anyone looking for examples of how actual groups run and play folk RPGs, and most importantly, if you haven't found your group yet, you're welcome here at ours.